Before we hear from our excellent panelists today, I wanted to share fairly briefly some information to provide a little bit of context for the webinar about Nicaragua, about the Sandinista Revolution, about the ATC, and also about solidarity with all of these. It's nice to hear, or nice to see some familiar names here that are joining us today, but I also am seeing here some folks who might not be familiar with the content that we're talking about. So the next couple of minutes will be dedicated kind of to giving some of this context. So Jenny, if you could do me a favor, and if we can go into play mode and go to the next slide. Thank you. So briefly, I wanted to start with here a map of where Nicaragua is located in the middle of the Central American Isthmus within the continent of the Americas. Nicaragua itself has a very fascinating history, which we're not going to go into all of the details today. And a large part of that history is a long struggle of resistance against colonialism and also against imperialist aggression, which continues today. In this webinar itself, we'll be focusing more so on recent history, the context and the processes of the Sandinista Revolution, which is a revolution that triumphed on the famous date of July 19th, 1979. Jenny, if you could go to the next slide. This revolution overthrew the US-backed Somoza dictatorship, which was in power for over 40 years. And this revolution was really inspired by the ideals of anti-imperialism, national sovereignty, and a unified Latin American identity, which are ideals that came from the general of free men and women, as he was known, Augusto Calderon Sandino, who were organized in the 1920s, a guerrilla army in Nicaragua to kick out the US Marine occupation that was taking place at that time. So when the revolution triumphs in 1979, the Sandinistas begin to implement a wide range of very amazing social programs to really benefit the poor of Nicaragua that had never lived through a government that had any interest in them. This included an agrarian reform, healthcare programs, a very famous literacy campaign. But with all of this came very quickly the US financing of a very bloody, horrific counter-revolution, millions of dollars to try and stamp out these revolutionary processes. And this is, putting in the context of today's panel, really the time when there was a boom in international solidarity with Nicaragua. Lots of young people, thousands and thousands of young people and not young people, who followed the case of Nicaragua and also came to Nicaragua to document what was happening, to participate in brigades to construct schools, houses, to harvest coffee and cotton. And in Friends of the ATC, we often talk a lot about the context of Ben Linder, a young North American engineer who you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, who felt very inspired by the revolution and its goals of improving the quality of life for the poor. And he was actually killed or murdered by the US-backed Contras here in Nicaragua in 1987. Next slide, Jenny. So we have the case of the revolution, and the ATC, or Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo, Railroad Workers Association of Nicaragua, is born exactly in this context of the revolution in the 1970s as part of a diverse alliance of different groups from the popular sector of Nicaragua that organized to overthrow this dictatorship, and that also had and continued to have a vision for a more just and equitable nation of Nicaragua. The ATC itself, its organizing has focused, as the name implies, on the countryside, in rural areas, and defending the rights of people who grow food for the nation of Nicaragua. So we have two main categories there. There are farm workers working on large-scale farms, as well as small farmers and peasants who are growing food at a very small scale in diversified parcels. The ATC is also well known for, in the 1980s, being part of this massive agrarian reform process, which redistributed about half of the country's arable land away from the hands of the dictatorship into the hands of about 120,000 peasant families. And that really laid the groundwork for what is today a very food self-sufficient country. It's important to note that Nicaragua is still very much an agrarian nation. About half of its population is rural and produces somewhere between 80 and 90% of its food, mostly produced by small-scale farmers, and that's very important in the context of the ATC. Today, a major part of the ATC's organizing focuses on training, or what we call in Spanish, formación, on a wide range of topics, including workers' rights, union organizing, agroecology, or different ways of sustainable agriculture, combined with reclaiming traditional knowledge about how to tend to the land. And there's a big focus on women and youth. One last thing I want to mention about the ATC is that in the 1990s, the ATC helped to found an international peasant movement called Via Campesina, which represents over 200 million peasants, small farmers, indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. And it's the movement that's very well known because it coined this concept or term called food sovereignty, which is basically the right of peoples, and especially peasants, to define and defend their own food systems, where healthy food is a human right rather than a business. And we find that a lot of the Solidarity community is very interested in this topic of Via Campesina and food sovereignty and comes to us in that kind of way too. So lastly, to kind of start the process of our panelists, I want to explain a little bit about Friends of the ATC. Jenny, if you could go to the last slide that I have. Friends of the ATC is a solidarity network with the ATC, as I mentioned. It's fairly young. It's kind of been organizing under this name for about 4 years now. And it's a solidarity network that organizes at local levels and international levels to spread awareness and build solidarity with the ATC as an organization. But as you can kind of understand based upon what I just explained, we're also building solidarity with Nicaragua, with the Sandinista Revolution, and the international peasant movement that's fighting for food sovereignty. We do a lot of organizing of people-to-people exchanges through delegations, speaking tours. We create different kinds of publications, mostly in the English language, and we also do some fundraising for the ATC. And to kind of segue into the panel itself, one thing that we think is very important for Friends of the ATC is to learn our history and not forget it. Not just about the ATC itself or maybe about the revolution, but also about international solidarity with these things. Because we think it's important to understand how these processes are something that happen over decades and over long periods of time and learn from that. So I want to highlight that this is especially important in the context of basically an onslaught of fake news in circulation about Nicaragua. There's especially a spike in that since the beginning of the 2018 failed coup attempt that took place here in Nicaragua, but also during the current COVID-19 pandemic. Here, briefly, I want to mention that the Sandinistas were in power in the 1980s. They fell out of power in 1990 with elections, which brought in 16 years of neoliberal governments. But in 2007, the Sandinista Front came back into power, and since then has been implementing a lot of very impressive social programs that in a lot of ways complement the grassroots organizing and training that the ATC does in the countryside. There's different programs for free healthcare, free public education all the way through university, and dozens of programs to support small businesses as well as small farmers to be able to grow food for the nation. So a lot of what we do in Friends of the ATC and a lot of kind of our motivation for the panel was to study this context and how these different kinds of things complement one another and what does that mean for how we can show true solidarity. So today we want to speak to three friends of the ATC about this topic of solidarity with the ATC, but also with Nicaragua, how they got involved with this kind of solidarity organizing, what are maybe some lessons they've learned over time, and how are we making solidarity organizing urgent, militant, as we might say, and internationalist and relevant today. So each presenter will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have hopefully a little bit of time for some questions and answers. You can locate, if you locate the chat box at the bottom of your screen, if you're on your telephone or on your computer, you can write your questions in the chat box there, and we will look at those upon conclusion of the webinar. So I think with that, we can start with our first panelist. I'll introduce each panelist directly right before they speak. So our first panelist, and Jenny, maybe just say that we can go to her PowerPoint since I finished mine. Our first panelist is the very amazing Magda Lanuza. She's a Nicaraguan feminist who has been based in El Salvador since 2006. She graduated from Brandeis University in Boston and has worked as a consultant for international organizations and has also supported farmer organizations in a wide range of ways, including different member organizations of Via Campesina and the ATC. So with that, I will pass the mic off to Magda. Thank you very much for joining us, Magda.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I had my mic off. Magda, I am Nicaraguan. For those of you who don't know me, I have been living in El Salvador for the last few years, but I am always Nicaraguan, as I have been always in love with the farmers. Myself, I come from a rural family in Nicaragua, in the north, in Esteli. I grew up there, and I am part of the Solidarity movement. But also I am involved as part of the whole group. As Erica mentioned a little bit of what happened in Nicaragua after the 90s when the revolution was lost. Farmers during the 80s with the revolution, they won a lot in terms of their rights, the right to education, health, land's right, the right to organize and produce their own food. But when the revolution was lost in 1990, there was that campaign directed, financed, and organized to dismantle all the rights and all the progress for rural families, for rural population in Nicaragua that were and still are almost half of the population. It was in 1994 when farmers, mainly from Jinotega and Matagalpa, the coffee growing areas, they were in despair because they even didn't have food. Most of their cooperatives were dismantled. There were no loans, no technical support. Schools were collapsing. Health care was not even available for rural families. And there were many years, and I remember traveling from Esteli to Managua to my university and then to work. I was seeing the families that left their homes and spent months on the roadsides to Managua with signs asking for food and demanding the rights of the farmers to the three governments, Doña Violeta, then Alemán, and finally with the last government in 2002, Bolaños, they signed an agreement that at least made another struggle to succeed for rural farmers in Nicaragua, and ATC was up front since the very beginning. Then more years of struggles came after that. There was a long struggle in Nicaragua to protect environment. The neoliberal governments put on sale all natural resources. There were huge projects, huge investments for clear cutting and taking the land from farmers. ATC was up front there in that struggle, and then another struggle came, and we got together with many groups to struggle against the Central American Free Trade Agreement. I don't know if you have still memories of that agreement that was at some point put in risk small and medium farmers that were producing our own food, and the government was preparing the investments for food dumping from the United States. That made that free trade agreement and all the neoliberal policies against rural population in Nicaragua made as a result, 70% of the capacity to produce our own food was lost, 70%. Then those 10 years of long and non-stop struggles in Nicaragua to protect farmers made me think, and my thesis is about that those neoliberal policies that took farmers' rights and made them just people to make their own way to survive for over 15 years. Nicaragua knows about solidarity and has a solid faith and hope in the power of international solidarity. And we learned that since the 80s, when the groups from the United States, some of them never heard of Nicaragua before, traveled down there, get to know what was happening, and got that real truth, and went back home and made that those voices heard. Then the war ended, the Congress stopped funding directly the Contras, and there was that need to build peace. Then that solidarity in 1990 was lost when the revolution gave the power to Doña Violeta, the government who got elected. And it happened that ATC and many rural farmers didn't have friends with international people. The people from the revolution part that built those relationships with foreign colleagues were poets, musicians, writers, in working for the Sandinista government. They were the elite, some of them highly educated, some of them spoke French, English very well. And they were the ones that in 1990, they were so upset with the FSLM, with the grassroots groups of the FSLM, that they walk out and they built up their own political party. But they were just intellectuals, elites, well-educated, that were in love with the idea of having a revolution, but they were not able to go forward, and they stayed themselves. Nobody voted for them. The FSLN instead grew from the grassroots groups, and this is what we have now in Nicaragua. Those people who were the ones who suffered the worst in the 90s with 3 neoliberal governments. For many, many years, Nicaragua was not on international news. For many years. It started again in 2018. Just 2 years ago. And as Erika mentioned, there were those events that make Nicaragua again in the international news are still in Nicaragua this day, not for the good, not to tell the truth, not to say that the Nicaragua health system is one of the best in the world because it has a preventive approach, not just because it saves lives, not just because it saves money, because it saves people's dignity. In these days, when we have a pandemic around the world, it's very difficult in Central America. The news every day are just outstanding. Numbers go up. We only talk about numbers. And we can say that one size fits all. I don't think that rule applies for all the countries, and I know the World Health Organization has been working in directing the pandemic, and I can talk about the these two countries, differences and similarities. And we can see that Nicaragua invests 21% of their national budget. I know in the United States you don't have such budget for the entire country, but Nicaragua has it, El Salvador as well. But in El Salvador, they only allocated 11.7% of the total budget. So in El Salvador, the president himself has declared quarantines, lockdowns, and all was based on alarming the population, inflating mathematics and making up numbers of what was going to happen. In Nicaragua, the strategy was totally different. Started with very small cases, not alarming people, and preparing with knowledge, having a proactive and preventive approach. That's still the health system in Nicaragua today. The militarization of the pandemic in El Salvador has brought up many human rights abuses and many issues that, of course, are not portrayed in the international media for the reasons we might consider later asking, but that's the situation. And also debts, huge debts in El Salvador. 3 billion have been put to fuel the economic, and also pay for social protection for people who have been for over 3 months now locked down. The situation is complex everywhere in the world. It's very difficult to judge who is doing the best, who is doing the better. I think this is not a competition. All the states, rich and poor, were not prepared for this. Doctors and nurses from any part of the world were not prepared at those schools to deal with pandemics. We humans have no idea and no recent history how to live in a pandemic like this. But we can see that the campaign against Nicaragua started again in April. April 1st this year the campaign is the authorities, the government are doing nothing. That's the campaign, and it's all propelled with fake news. Everything starts from any phone, any smartphone, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, and then it goes to Deutsche Welle, to CNN and all the international media. They are not really interested on the people, how people are living. They are interested in portraying the big picture of the government the people are dying and the government is doing nothing. They repeat and repeat. And this campaign has only the purpose that they believe that what the campaign or the coup d'etat they started in 2018 did not work, but this time they will succeed. That's the belief they have. But again, Nicaragua must stand up. We have to tell the truth. We have to get our voices heard. And the grassroots groups and ATC and many groups that are dealing and struggling with all the issues and standing up for their rights, they will go and they will move on. And we need the international solidarity. We have faith, we have hope in all the work that solidarity can do. And this is how Nicaragua is facing this pandemic today. We have the solidarity of Cuba, Taiwan, the World Health Organization sending packages. We haven't allocated billions. We are not incrementing our external debt. We are not putting more money into the internal debt. It's our farmers. Now planting is made, the good season to plant our food, and farmers, small, medium, are planting our food. Nicaragua will not die of hunger, as we have seen pictures in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Magda, for these your very important intervention of 10 minutes and your slides. Very important content that you have to share. I already see some questions coming in. Feel free to write your questions as you have them in the chat box, and we'll look at those at the end. We'll now move on to our second panelist, Dan Kovalik, who is connecting today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Dan is a U.S. human rights lawyer, professor, and peace activist, and has been following Nicaraguan politics for the past 40 years. Visited that country for the first time in 1987 and has been continuing to visit ever since then. Fairly recently, Dan released a documentary that's called Nicaragua, the April Crisis and Beyond, which is about the 2018 failed coup attempt, which is available on YouTube, and we will recirculate the YouTube link for all of the people attending today. So with that, Dan, it's all you. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And thank you everyone who's participating today. Nicaragua is probably my favorite subject. For many of us, Nicaragua politically is my first love. Nicaragua really changed who I am, and really changed the course of my life. And it changed a lot of people who went there, particularly during the 80s, which were a very heady time. As has been mentioned, you know, the 80s were a time when the revolution was just beginning, and the US tried to destroy the revolution in its crib, so to speak, by supporting the Contras, who were largely led by former National Guardsmen of the dictatorship, the Somoza dictatorship. And it was a brutal war, and that needs to be pointed out, how brutal it was. The goal was never really to overthrow the government militarily, because they knew they couldn't do it. The Contras had no popular support. They never gained any land. So the goal was to destroy infrastructure, to murder technicians like doctors, engineers like Ben Linder, an American who was mentioned, was killed in 1987, very shortly before I went there for the first time. And essentially through terrorism, and that's what it was, to bring the revolution to its knees, which it did happen temporarily in 1990. Really, the Sandinistas lost the election in 1990 under the threat of continued war. The U.S. made it clear, you have a choice. You can vote out the Sandinistas, or you'll continue to be a victim of the Contras. We'll continue to support this group against you, this group that killed about 30,000 Nicaraguans, which is a huge number, because at that time there were less than 3 million Nicaraguans. It's a tiny little country. Today it's double the size, about 6 million, but still very tiny. And the people were exhausted. And by the way, I should note that the International Court of Justice, the highest court internationally, also known as the World Court, would rule against the United States in a very famous case. In fact, the most famous international law case, Nicaragua versus the United States. And the International Court of Justice found that the U.S. acted unlawfully in a number of ways by supporting the Contras, by mining Nicaragua's harbors, and by generally committing acts of terror against that country. But again, the U.S. ignored that decision, and it wasn't enough to save the Sandinistas, at least temporarily there in the election of 1990. I just want to mention very briefly, because, you know, history does repeat itself. It should be noted that not only was Nicaragua struggling in the 80s against U.S.-backed aggression, but so was El Salvador, which had its own revolutionary movement. In fact, they have the same colors as the Sandinistas, the FMLN. There, Guatemala was suffering what is now considered a genocide. It's well accepted that the U.S. supported a genocidal war in Guatemala during that time. And how I say history repeats itself is that the man who's now critical in advising Trump, who has an official position in the White House advising Trump on foreign policy issues, is Elliott Abrams, who was working for Ronald Reagan during this time, who helped cover up the genocide in Guatemala, who helped cover up the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador, in which 800 to 1,000 civilians, peasants, mostly women and children, were murdered by U.S.-backed forces. He also ended up being convicted of perjury before Congress for lying about his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, which, if you're too young to remember or to know about, was a scandal in which the Reagan administration continued to fund the Contras illegally after Congress cut off aid to the Contras by selling arms shipments to Iran in return for cash they gave to the Contras, and, by the way, by selling cocaine on the streets of the United States, as the great journalist Gary Webb exposed. And so we now see this same psychopath in charge of a major portion of U.S. foreign policy. Those are the struggles those countries are facing at the time. The good news was that there were internationalists from all over the world who traveled, particularly to Nicaragua during the time, to support the revolution there, to show solidarity. And I was one of those people in 1987, and I was pretty naive when I first went there, didn't really understand what U.S. imperialism was, didn't really understand what the Contras were, didn't really understand what the Sandinistas were. And I was greatly impressed by the struggle there by a country that was dirt poor. I mean, at that time, it was hard to find a road that was even paved. It was hard to find a place with electricity. It was hard to find a place with sewage and running water. You'd see kids walking around without shoes, right? Which is a huge thing. Whether kids have shoes or not in countries like Nicaragua really shows how poor that country is. And yet this poor little country who had just had a revolution, who had already lost 50,000 people in the insurrection against Somoza, were now having to fight to defend their revolution. And it was amazingly inspiring. Again, people from everywhere. And that was the excitement back then. You go to Nicaragua and you'd meet not only Nicaraguans, but people from other Latin American countries, people from Western Europe, people from Eastern Europe. And again, what I like about the word solidarity is it's not charity. Solidarity suggests a mutual coming together for mutual goals. And the people who went to Nicaragua at that time got as much or more from their work in that country as the Nicaraguans got from us being there. Let me make that clear. That it was a life-transforming event. It is still life-transforming to go there and to be with these people and to be part of a struggle, again, of the poorest of the poor, defending their revolution, trying to survive in a very difficult time. And the backbone of the revolution are the small farmers. Those are the people that Sandino saw himself fighting for land for them, for autonomy. And that promise of Sandino has been met by the Sandinistas, who have given a lot of land to campesinos, given the campesinos a lot of support in various ways. And that is why Nicaragua is one of the few food sovereign countries in the developing world, because of those policies of the Sandinistas. And the ATC, I really got involved with during the 2018 crisis, in which I wanted to get to establish my work with Nicaragua because of what I saw was the misinformation about Nicaragua at that time, and because of the brutality of the opposition forces at that time against the people and against the Sandinistas. And the ATC really stood out as a group that was holding its ground down there, and the Friends of the ATC was very much a part of that, and continued to work with the ATC on the ground during the crisis, during a time in which, people were being killed for being Sandinistas. And the Friends of the ATC, Erica in particular, were there doing the work. And I'm very moved by the fact that they've done that and stuck it out all these years, because these are the difficult years, right? The 80s, in a way, were easy because it was such an exciting kind of sexy time with the military defense of Nicaragua. Now it's not so military. Now it's more ideological. And that's a harder, more amorphous battle. But it's a battle that must be won against very powerful media forces that, as the speakers before me have noted, are relentless in attacking Nicaragua, are relentless in attacking the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega. And they've been effective in part because of something that Magda mentioned. And that was that, you know, the Sandinistas, in order to win against Somoza, who was being supported to the end by the U.S. with planes that were bombing. Somoza used to bomb his own people, and tanks and whatnot. The Sandinistas had to work with the bourgeoisie, if you allow me to use that word, with the wealthier, more well-to-do parts of society, intellectuals, who also found Somoza at that point to be unacceptable. And that's a very common strategy. You have to do that to win the revolution, and that is how the revolution was won. But as Magda pointed out, those same members of the bourgeoisie and intellectuals would end up really turning on the Sandinistas during the defeat of 1990, mostly because, you know, the Sandinistas were seen as failures because they had lost, right? And the Sandinistas kept up the fight, and the, you know, this other group, which is represented by the MRS, which you may have heard of, they basically, their struggle became one simply to denounce and the Sandinistas. And unfortunately, here's an irony: some of the solidarity work that was done in the 80s with Nicaragua backfired in a way, because a lot of people had relationships with those people who would join the MRS, and a lot of those people in the US and Europe were fooled by those people in the MRS, even to this day. Democracy Now!, for example, often have people from the MRS on to talk about Nicaragua, and people don't see through their lies and, frankly, through their class allegiances. And that is something people need to understand. But as was noted, the MRS in Nicaragua has no support. They polled about 1.5% during elections. 1.5%. I mean, that's a joke, right? But they have huge influence in the West. Again, partly due to some of the work in the 80s. And so a lot of people who did work in the 80s, I think, have lost their bearings on Nicaragua. And I see it as my job. I know Erica sees it as her job. And a lot of us see it as our job to really continue to defend the revolution that we love, that made us who we are. I'll just end, well, I'll say a couple more things. I mean, just to throw out a couple statistics. You know, when the Sandinistas took over in 2007, from 17 years of neoliberal government supported by the US, the country was about 15% electrified. It's now nearly 100% electrified. When they took over in 2007, the roads still weren't paved. Now, if you drive in Nicaragua, it's hard to find an unpaved road. You find major, beautiful highways. You always see construction on them. You see brand new hospitals put up, clinics put up. That's what the Sandinistas have done with the people. The other fascinating statistic is that, according to the UN body that evaluates gender equality in the world, Nicaragua is number 5 in the world for gender equality, after 4 Scandinavian countries. This is incredible. And again, this is all due to the Sandinistas. And so for us, you know, we believe the revolution is worth defending. It is worth helping, fighting for. And the Nicaraguans could not be more, can I just say, gracious and grateful for that help. The Nicaraguans never, ever forget people who come to their aid in their time of need. People still don't forget Ben Linder to this day. As a Pittsburgher, I'll tell you, people still don't forget the great one, member of the Pittsburgh Pirates, outfielder, Roberto Clemente, who died trying to bring aid to Nicaragua in 1972 during the earthquake. And if you go down there to this day, there's schools named after them, stadiums. The point is that, you know, the love you give to Nicaragua, you will get back in spades. And again, I want to thank Erica and the Friends of the ATC for your work, because you really, truly have stood out as one of the models for solidarity. And I really applaud you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for those kind concluding words, and also for a very important history lesson. This is exactly why we want to have folks like you join us on these panels. So thanks so much, Dan. So we'll now go to our third panelist. Sara Roschdi is a graduate student. Let me get the full bio up here at UCLA. And she's also an organizer with the Chiapas Support Committee, a Los Angeles-based international solidarity collective rooted in Zapatista principles and Black liberation struggles. In July of 2019, we had the honor of having Sara here in Nicaragua. She was participating in the Friends of the ATC Solidarity delegation that took place. And that experience inspired her to write her master's thesis on the Sandinista Revolution and the failed US-backed coup attempt in 2018. So with that, we will hear from Sara. Thanks so much for being here today with us, Sara.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just so inspired to be on this panel. I'm also, similarly to Dan, so inspired by Nicaraguan social movements. And so how I personally got involved in international solidarity work, as you said, I organized in Chiapas Support Committee, and we accompany movements across popular struggle across Latin America, from Haiti, Honduras, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. I also got involved in this because I was doing worker organizing in Los Angeles with car wash workers and day laborers. And there was a lot of, I was learning a lot about CAFTA and NAFTA and free trade agreements, and how they were really pushing and displacing campesinos and indigenous peoples from their lands. And I really wanted to merge this work. How can I be involved with worker struggles in the US, but what can we learn from movements in Latin America that are fighting US empire head on? I also come from a lineage that has inspired me to do this work. My mother's family were farm workers in Northern California, Mexican farm workers. My dad is an Iranian immigrant that participated in the Iranian Revolution. And I've seen as my role in social movements and in my research to really merge these histories of solidarity, of internationalism, and of worker movements. So this brings me to, how did I get to Nicaragua? Prior to the April 2018 coup attempt, I could honestly say I knew Nicaragua in the 80s. I knew the Sandinista Revolution. I was inspired by this history, but I knew very little about what was contemporarily happening in Nicaragua. A year prior, I was in Honduras, but little did I know how different conditions were in Nicaragua. When the April 2018 coup attempt was happening, there was a lot of just misinformation and disinformation on the US side. We were seeing social movements aligning with Donald Trump and Secretary John Bolton, and calling Nicaragua a part of the trifecta of tyranny with Cuba and Venezuela. And we were seeing, if they're being associated to Venezuela and Cuba, then we really need to be knowing what's going on with social movements in Nicaragua. So we, as an organization, knew that we needed to get we need to connect with campesinos on the ground, working people who are really defending and developing movements in the countryside. So this inspired me to go on this delegation that really, similarly to Dan, completely changed my life. I was so shocked when I got off the plane to just be in the city of Managua and see beautiful signs across the country that say Socialismo, Internacionalismo, Revolucionarios, something that I wish we had painted all over the streets of downtown Los Angeles, something that I see as a part of my core and of movements that I really want to, that I want us to develop in the US, I see happening in Nicaragua. I was saying it's like the best kept secret. I was in Central America. I had no idea that this like socialist revolutionary country was of how much they were really building in Nicaragua. We visited cooperatives across the countryside who were developing their own foods with support with the Sandinista government. They were getting access to the seeds to grow. They were getting access to livestock. We spoke to people who lived through the Somoza dictatorship in the neoliberal era and the Contra Wars, who now have children that are going to medical school, and things that we saw that I've seen before in Cuba, heard about in Venezuela. And I was just a year prior in Honduras, and the conditions could not be more starkly different. We interviewed students at Ayala, the Latin American Institute for Agroecology. And they had students from across Central America, from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala, from Dominican Republic, who talked about how Nicaragua was just so starkly different from the access to, and across the countryside we saw this, from the access to free and public health care, to free education, to like what was discussed with Dan, the importance of roads. Roads are something that we take for granted in the US, but in Nicaragua, these roads have connected campesino communities to the marketplace, to be able to access free education, to be access public health care. Something that, to bring again back to Honduras, I was there a year prior, and the roads were leading from megatourism projects, dividing indigenous communities and leading to city centers. Having the cities were built for international corporations and to divide and displace indigenous people. In Nicaragua, it was exactly the opposite of the case. These roads were built to help cooperatives to be able to fill the Nicaraguan markets. Like as Dan was saying, they produce over we've heard, close to 90% of all the food in the country. Think about this in this moment of a global pandemic. I know that in the streets of Los Angeles, we have immigrant communities that are not lacking, that are desperate for food because of such high unemployment. I'm just like so inspired by the people of Nicaragua, because they will truly not go hungry. They do not, I'm just so inspired because they not only supplied the food to sustain their own families, but to sustain their communities and their nation as a whole. And these cooperatives are not only not only sustain their communities, but they politically develop the community members to really be participants, active participants in their government. Something that we know in the US, our communities are so disenfranchised from. We're so separated from our government. But these campesinos, these cooperatives are actually political formations that are leading social movements, that are developing policies in the countryside. Things that when Dan was talking about solidarity, I was like, yes, we in the US have so much to learn from the Nicaraguans. We have so much to learn from their social movements. They're developing food sovereignty. They've been able to fight US imperialism. They've been able to fight disinformation campaigns, something that I know social movements in the US are trying to strategize around. How can we meet the needs of our community? How can we really safeguard our sovereignty and autonomy? And something that's particularly inspiring to me with the Sandinistas is that food sovereignty is really their pillar of struggle. This is how they are fighting imperialism globally. They're not only, this food sovereignty is minimizing their dependence on global foreign markets that we see in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. These free trade zones are depleting the country of their resources, and the countries are still depending on these foreign exports to feed their people. So we see in Nicaragua, they're not only pushing away these transnational corporations, they're also sustaining their own people, but also supplying food and resources to Cuba and Venezuela, other countries that are facing sanctions that, as we know, these sanctions are murderous. They cripple the country's economy to the point of not being able to access medicine. In my family's country of Iran, these sanctions are so deadly in the time of coronavirus, but we see inclinations like Nicaragua, they're really working to safeguard their autonomy and really fight to maintain these movements across the countryside. That's why when I went to Nicaragua, I came back so really inspired, because one, I'm seeing socialism winning. I'm seeing revolutions that are active, that are being led by women, things that in the US we're not hearing. We're not hearing these really heroic tales of movement leaders that are really fighting to protect their communities. Another point I want to share is I have a quote so as I'm talking about this, I also, I'm using the testimonies that we collected in this delegation. Something that was really particularly important about this delegation is that it was engaged in a testimonies projects to really recuperate the truth of what was happening in Nicaragua. What were campesinos saying? What were their experiences? So, and I'm now utilizing these testimonies to really fight back against the claims that are both in academia and in across US media that say that the Sandinista government doesn't care about poor people, that says all these horrible things, that these testimonies show quite the opposite. They show the people's power that is really built across the country. And as Dan, so I'll share one quote from a woman named Eloisa Garcia. She's of the Santa Julia region, and she's the president of the Gloria Quintanilla Cooperative. So this quote says, "I used to have nothing. I had nowhere to live. I was born in a camp. I had no home. We didn't have any clothing. We only had 3 dresses. I didn't wear shoes. I first put shoes on when I was 14. There was no schools. I never went in order to help my mothers. I feel that I did something in my life, and now I have been blessed. I showed love. With that love, I've harvested for the people, for my community, and for my children. I have 5 sons and 1 daughter. They're already born with better conditions, different from mine. The right does not want progress for us poor people. The right wants us to live buried and them above us. They don't want us to have land. They don't want to allow President Daniel to help the poor. They want him to be holding hands, helping private companies. I am a peasant and proud. I feel that they have helped us. Of course, they won't say, come in and tell us, make this rice, cook it. No, they'll give us the tools we need to develop our own rice, to develop our own beans, and sell our products in the market." So this is just one example of a small bit of a testimony that we have over 30 of that really tell you exactly what are the conditions in Nicaragua currently and have really inspired me so deeply. This woman grew up under a Somoza work camp where she was really enslaved labor, and now is the leader of her own cooperative, who her children are getting free education, going to school, getting medical care, something that we are fighting for in the United States tooth and nail to have for our communities. So I really hope that a lot of you get inspired to do this international solidarity work, because I know most of us are in the global north, and we're really trying to build up our social movements to fight global capitalism. Really, we need to be looking at these movements in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East that are really fighting US imperialism head on and winning. So thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to have been on this panel. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sara, for sharing your personal testimony of how you became involved in international solidarity work and what your experience was like with us last year here in Nicaragua and with the Friends of the ATC delegation, and sharing an excellent job of sharing some of these central messages that we always try to share in our solidarity organizing, and the importance of supporting small farmers who are very much entrenched in revolutionary processes here in the country. So let's see, I'm looking at the time. We have a short amount of time for questions, and we've been receiving a number of questions throughout the time of the panel. I was thinking that we could kind of do 2 groups. One group being, the first one we got a couple questions about, because it's the current context about COVID-19. And then some others that are more specifically about how to organize solidarity now in the current time when we can't do international travel or that kind of thing. So perhaps I will start first with the coronavirus questions. There's one person asking if we could just get a little bit of an update on the daily response to COVID here in Nicaragua, and also a comment that came through early on about seeing an article in Al Jazeera about Nicaraguan funeral directors running out of coffins and saying that they're forced to bury people at night. What's that about? So these both relate to the response to Nicaragua's response to COVID-19, and there's also a lot of fake news circulating about that. So I'm wondering if anyone from the panel would be willing to, perhaps Magda can take a first response related to that, and if anyone else wants to fill in, there will be time to do so.
Very just shortly, I just wrote a short answer on the chat of the group, if some of you can read that. And it has been sent to all the panelists. I think it was Alex from England who asked that. And as I said, there is an ongoing non-stop evil dimensional campaign against Nicaragua again. This is a second stage. The first one happened in 2018. Now we're facing a second one. And this is even out of any, what could I say? Anything that we could have expected. It's beyond of anything that we can think that is happening. They are not portraying the people dying or being buried in Guatemala, Honduras, Ecuador, wherever in the world. They are looking at Nicaragua, and they get those pictures and videos from Facebook, from even they had been mimicking burials at night, practically portraying themselves, playing a game, and sending those, and they are already on Al Jazeera, CNN, all those international media. First, they don't look, the journalism that we used to know that was searching and getting the information on the ground doesn't exist anymore, because they are not traveling, because they are just pulling, copying and pasting what they see on the social media. And then they have the wrong contact people in Nicaragua for the international media. And it's all political bias. Whatever you see nowadays from any international media from Nicaragua, it can be true. Some people dying every day in Nicaragua, as any part of the world, from coronavirus, from any other causes. What's the problem? It was not before on the news. Now all the people, sick people dying in Nicaragua has to be on the news, and it's all around Facebook, Twitter, all the social media, in CNN, Democracy Now, just copy and paste, repeat, no question. They don't go, they don't search, they don't look around. I won't go into more details of that, but that's what is happening and what we can do for solidarity these days. I said Nicaragua will survive, Nicaragua will make it. It's a different way, different approach Nicaragua took on this pandemic. For many other reasons, each country has a sovereign right to do based on the resources, based on their culture, based on their own capacities. Nicaragua choose to go in a different way, and that's the right. And we have to accept that, those who are abroad. And as I said, the farmers are growing now. Nicaragua had plenty of food. They were exporting to El Salvador just before the pandemic. El Salvador bought all the grains they don't produce. It's exporting milk. All the dairy products travel from Nicaragua to Guatemala, to El Salvador, even to Costa Rica. That now Costa Rica is playing another political side in this, because I know there are forces, not just a virus, there are political forces, money in place, thrown in Nicaragua, thinking that this is the chance, the real chance to take a government out. A government that has been elected. I don't think we here, we have the right to say, I like this government, I don't like that government. We don't have the right to say, oh, it's time for them to go and leave. No, if the people elected, if the Nicaraguan people elected those authorities, they should be there because that's democracy. The Nicaraguan constitution says the president is elected every 5 years. In the United States, people, even if you don't like your current president, you never dare to say, oh, it's time to change, let's get rid of him. No, you have to wait. And we have to wait in the United States, we have to wait in Colombia, then we have to wait in Nicaragua. And this pandemic will not move a government that has built up on the people's rights. It's a government that I have seen when I started working again in Nicaragua in 2009. I was traveling to rural villages in Matagalpa, Jinotega, no roads, totally terrible. To get there 3 hours to get to a village. Now paved roads. In 40 minutes, I am there with the people, and the people are happier. The people can get to the health posts, to the hospitals. People can manage to go to the cities in just few minutes. Nice buses. Before, in just few years ago, 2009, 2010, I was traveling all over. I couldn't see anything like that. So this is something that we have to stand for, and Solidarity has to understand that Nicaragua now will survive with what the farmers are doing, producing food, producing all what we need. We are not importing food. El Salvador is importing most of the food. Guatemala is importing from Nicaragua dairy and milk products. Honduras as well, Costa Rica as well. Nicaragua is not importing. They are ready to export and sell to all the other Central American countries. And we have the solidarity of Cuba, Taiwan, and South Korea. And hopefully the World Health Organization will help us to get through. I know the IMF denied, the World Bank, all the international financial institutions have said no money to Nicaragua, whereas in El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras, just 2 weeks ago, they got millions from the International Monetary Fund to solve the pandemic. So Nicaragua have their own resources, their own people, and their own health approach, and that will save them.
Thank you, Magda, and thank you for addressing both kind of categories of the questions. What I think we could do to kind of start closing up the panel is I'd like to invite Dan and then Sara if they want to either make any comment about what they've seen in terms of Nicaragua's response to COVID-19, the pandemic, but also this really important question that Jill Clark wrote in the chat about, she as well as us and friends of the ATC have been telling people, come to Nicaragua, come here to Nicaragua. I'm here in Managua, Nicaragua, in the national offices of the ATC to see with your own eyes what's happening. But right now, of course, we know that international travel is not a thing. And so what are the other tasks that we can engage in related to solidarity? So first Dan and then Sara, and then I'll make a few concluding comments.
Yes, I will be very brief. First, I would say the main act of solidarity people can give now is to defend Nicaragua against the propaganda. To do so in newspapers, letters to the editor, to do so on social media. I think that's the best thing that we can do. And I think that when you look at the facts, they speak for themselves as to the numbers, how well Nicaragua is doing compared to other countries in the region, and certainly compared to the colossus of the north, the United States, which has the very worst statistics of any country for COVID-19, which, of course, makes it so infuriating when people in the US criticize other countries about how they're handling it. Moreover, you have to also look at the fact that Nicaragua is dealing with this pandemic in the midst of heightened US sanctions, which we didn't even talk about. The NICA Act, which was passed last year. And that is what has been instrumental in cutting Nicaragua off from international financing and loans of the type that Magda just mentioned. They had been, the World Bank congratulated Nicaragua and the Sandinistas for using international funds to reduce poverty, to build social programs. They are now being denied those very things. And so the accomplishments that they are having during the pandemic including their continued building of homes in Nicaragua for the poor, have to be seen in the context of the struggle against these sanctions, which is something else we can do to show solidarity with Nicaragua, to oppose those sanctions, to go to Congress, our congressional representatives, and ask them to end these sanctions against Nicaragua. I will just end by saying that the most recent poll I saw by M&R Consulting Company on Nicaragua was that Daniel Ortega is polling at about 55% support in that country. He does have popular support. Whether or not he is to be the continued leader of the Sandinistas and their continued presidential candidate is up to the Sandinista party, and they'll decide that. And I don't feel it's up to us to make that decision. I will say that I view him as frankly, a very important historical figure and a very important leader. I think my own feeling is that history will absolve him as history has absolved Fidel Castro. But again, who the leader of Nicaragua is going to be is up to the Nicaraguans, not me, not us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Sara?
Yes, to continue on Dan's point, something that I wanted to mention too was there's a big tendency in the United States to point fingers at other social movements, at other countries, and particularly at other socialist countries that are developing their own processes and systems. There's a tendency to be hypercritical of those processes. So I want us to really, something that I think is important to do in this time while people can't travel, is to maintain a really strong analysis on anti-imperialism so that you can weed through these lies. So you can see that the media that the US is propagating against the COVID-19 in Nicaragua and think, wait, how can the US really have ground to speak on this with the way we're handling it? And what can be the truth, and what are the realities and conditions on the ground, like Magda was saying, with being able to produce their own food and also export. So I really think in this moment, as we see coups against continue to be threatened in Venezuela, to the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, to Nicaraguans and the Sandinistas, we need to really maintain clarity and strengthen our anti-imperialist politics into solidarity, not as US folks or people of the global north saying, critiquing and hyper-criticizing movements, but rather, what can we learn from these movements? I tasked you to learn about different social movements, different anti-imperialist struggles. What can we in the US gain from these movements, and how can we be in solidarity with them? And how can we oppose these sanctions and really learn about what our country is doing to really destabilize these movements that we really have so much to learn from? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara, for those comments. I will just, because we're out of time, make a few concluding comments. First of all, I wanted to say, before I forget, that I'm going to put a link here in the chat box that on Thursday, for the folks who ask questions specifically about COVID-19, there is an ally organization to us that's based in the UK called the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group that has a webinar specifically on an analysis of COVID-19 in the context of US imperialism. So it will be an excellent way to continue the debate that we've had today. This organization is doing very important work to kind of what Dan has mentioned, to defend Nicaragua against all of this propaganda that's circulating internationally in Spanish language media and English language media, and including in media that we consider to be quote unquote progressive and that some of us might access. Another thing that I want to mention is that the Nicaraguan government just released a 75-page white paper that details their entire response to COVID-19. It's a very excellent summary also, not just of this response, but Nicaragua's community health model in general, inspired a lot by Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. And there's the things that governments in many, many other countries around the world could learn from this response. The other thing I want to conclude by saying is We hope that you'll continue to be in touch with us as a Solidarity organization. The Solidarity organizations that continue to have events like this, like Friends of the ATC, NSGAG, Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign of the UK, Alliance for Global Justice based in the US, are all important organizations to be involved with and also donate to if you have the means. There are different ways in which fundraising campaigns have been organized now, but it's also if you happen to have a few spare dollars, you can also donate to the different organizations doing solidarity work that pass funds directly to the different organizations. But this is a long battle, it's a long struggle, and we have to keep conversing, keep training, keep forming ourselves to defend processes that we really believe in, that also allow us to construct another society that we're all dreaming for, that's more just, that's more equitable. Just to conclude, we will circulate this webinar, which we have been recording via email, and it will be accessible on Friends of the ATC's YouTube channel. And you can also access more information at friendsatc.org in English. If you want to directly access the ATC's page, they have a Facebook page if you search for ATC Nicaragua. And last but not least, I want to thank, first of all, Jenny, who's behind the scenes here doing tech support for us. That wouldn't have been possible without her help. Also, the use of the Alliance for Global Justice's webinar account to be able to make this conversation accessible to all of our attendees. Thank you, everyone who registered and also have been listening, putting questions in the chat box. It's been very wonderful to have this conversation with you. And I want to thank Magda, Dan, and Sara for coming on today to share things that are really important and that we hope have been useful for everyone here today. So thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you all soon.